The term Judeo-Christian is thrown around constantly in modern discourse. Politicians, pundits, and even religious leaders use it to define the values of Western civilization. But is this an accurate representation of history, or a modern political construct that distorts the true foundations of European heritage? Today, we'll question the narrative behind the term Judeo-Christian and why it does not accurately reflect the actual development of Western civilization. The earliest recorded use of the term Judeo-Christian comes not from neither classical nor medieval theologians, but from 19th century German academia, where it was used in a specific academic and theological context. Judeo-Christian was primarily used to describe Jewish converts to Christianity, particularly in discussions about whether such individuals should be fully integrated into Protestant communities. The term was, originally, never used to describe a shared religious foundation, but rather to distinguish between original Christian teachings and those influenced by rabbinic doctrine. Now, what if I told you that one of the most radical thinkers of the 19th century, and someone who had first-hand exposure to this dilemma, would have rejected the term outright? Friedrich Nietzsche, the Übermensch himself, saw the term as a fundamental contradiction and, could be argued, rightly noticed that it was an attempt to unite two religious doctrines that, at their core, are at war with each other.
With the Jews, the slave revolt in morality begins. That revolt which has a history of 2,000 years behind it, and which we no longer see because it has been victorious.
As we can infer from this excerpt in On the Genealogy of Morality, first essay, Nietzsche seemingly believes that the Jewish religion was prone to moral deconstruction through reinterpretation of religious texts, leading to fluid, ever-changing laws, rather than a single authoritative tradition. Continuing with this observation, we may indirectly suggest that Protestant Christianity had absorbed elements of Jewish moral philosophy in a way that weakened traditional Christian teachings and accelerated the decline of Western civilization. He saw Protestantism, particularly Calvinism and Puritanism, as an exaggeration of Christianity's worst aspects, with its moral universalism, excessive focus on guilt, and rejection of hierarchical structures. Unlike Judaism, which remained an ethnic religion, Protestant Christianity universalized Jewish moral values, turning them into a doctrine for all of humanity. This, in Nietzsche's view, was the greatest catastrophe of the West, the triumph of the weak over the strong, the inversion of noble values, and the gradual decline of civilizations that once thrived on hierarchy, honor, and strength. His critique of the term Judeo-Christian was not just about theology, it was about civilization itself. He saw it as an ideological trap, a contradiction that eroded strength, diluted culture, and led to decadence. The West was not built on this fantastical synthesis. It was built on Catholic, Orthodox, and Greco-Roman foundations that shaped its moral and legal framework. Another clue to the artificial nature of the Judeo-Christian concept is its complete absence from pre-modern historical discourse. Despite nearly 2,000 years of Christian civilization, no medieval or early modern Christian theologians, philosophers, or rulers ever referred to their civilization as Judeo-Christian. Church fathers, including Augustine, Aquinas, and Chrysostom, saw Judaism as a distinct and often adversarial faith, not as a partner in shaping Christian morality. Early councils of the Church, including the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Ephesus, also explicitly distanced Christianity from Judaism, affirming that the New Covenant had superseded the Old. While Jewish communities existed within Christian Europe, what roles did they actually play in shaping the foundations of Western law, governance, and morality, as the label suggests? To begin with, one glaring contradiction in the Judeo-Christian narrative is the historical reality that Jews and Christians lived largely separate lives throughout most of Western history. Far from being integrated partners in shaping society, Jewish communities maintained distinct identities, often governed by their own religious and legal structures. Jewish communities lived under a separate legal framework known as rabbinic law, halakha, distinct from Christian legal traditions, and various European kingdoms implemented policies that regulated Jewish life, such as the Charter of the Jews of England, which granted Jews the right to reside, but placed restrictions on land ownership and professions, as well as the Spanish statutes of the 13th and 14th centuries, which confined Jews to specific districts and limited their interactions with Christians. Due to restrictions on land ownership and guild participation, Jews were often engaged in trade, commerce, and money lending. Medieval European kings relied on aspects of Jewish financiers for loans and tax collection, but these roles were not without controversy. The expulsion of Jews from England and France, for example, were largely linked to financial disputes and predatory lending practices, known commonly as usury. Where Christian teachings opposed usury, Jewish law permitted lending at interest to non-Jews, leading to constant conflicts over the efficacy of Jewish money lending practices within these host countries. Throughout the centuries, tensions between Christian rulers and Jewish communities erupted into disputes, restrictions, and even expulsions. If Judaism played a foundational role in Western civilization, why did Jewish communities live under separate laws, customs, and governance for nearly 2,000 years? Even with a fairly subsurface examination, the evidence suggests that Jewish communities functioned as distinct enclaves within Christian civilization, not as equal architects of Western traditions. So, if Christianity and Judaism were truly part of the same civilizational framework, why did no pre-modern Christian societies refer to themselves as Judeo-Christian? The answer is simple: because the term is a modern political construct, not a historical reality. For centuries, Christianity and Judaism have been understood as two distinct faiths. Despite their shared historical roots in the Old Testament, they diverged radically with the coming of Jesus Christ. The term Judeo-Christian suggests that these two faiths share a common theological and moral foundation, but in reality, they stand in direct opposition to fundamental theological doctrines. One of the most misunderstood differences between Christianity and Judaism is their understanding of Jesus Christ. For Christians, Jesus is the Son of God, the promised Messiah, and the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. For Judaism, however, Jesus is not the Messiah, nor is he divine. Christianity holds that Jesus is the incarnation of God, the second person of the Holy Trinity, and that faith in him is necessary for salvation. However, Judaism strictly maintains that God is absolutely one and indivisible, rejecting the notion that he could take on human form, even going as far as having passages in the Talmud that explicitly reject Jesus, with some rabbinical writings even portraying him negatively, or even suffering for eternity in a hell-like state. Another critical distinction between the two faiths is their recognition of biblical scripture, where Christians recognize both the Old Testament and New Testament as divinely inspired. Judaism, on the other hand, recognizes only the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, while giving equal or greater authority to the Talmud, which contains rabbinical interpretations and traditions written centuries after the Old Testament and frequently containing passages that conflict with Christian theology, as seen prior. The idea that Christianity and Judaism share a unified theological and moral foundation is a modern political fabrication. Judaism rejects Jesus Christ, denies original sin, holds a fundamentally different view of salvation, and does not recognize Christian scripture. These irreconcilable differences make it impossible to categorize them under the same moral framework. Understanding this is the first step in dismantling the false Judeo-Christian narrative and reaffirming the uniquely Christian foundations of Western civilization. So, if Christianity and Judaism are fundamentally distinct religions with fundamentally distinct histories, how did the term Judeo-Christian come into such prominence in modern politics? If the two faiths have such contradictory theological foundations, why do modern political and cultural institutions insist on framing them as part of a unified tradition? Well, in the 1930s and 1940s, political and religious leaders in the United States began using Judeo-Christian to create a moral coalition against fascism and communism, emphasizing shared Judeo-Christian values as a way to contrast Western religious morality against the perceived threat of factions seemingly in opposition to the liberalized US, British, and French leadership. Those threats predominantly being Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Upon the conclusion of World War II and following the establishment of Israel in 1948, American Christian Zionists and Jewish political groups found common ground in promoting the term Judeo-Christian to secure U.S. support for Israel. Organizations like the American Jewish Committee and Christian Zionist groups worked together to frame support for Israel as a moral and religious duty, taking advantage of extreme evangelical and Protestant guilt complexes via historical weaponization of the Holocaust. During the 1960s, liberal religious leaders further promoted Judeo-Christian as a term of religious inclusivity, helping to integrate Jewish communities more fully into American social and political life. This shift was particularly useful in opposing explicitly Christian nationalist movements that sought to maintain America's traditional Protestant identity. By the mid-20th century, Judeo-Christian had completely changed from a marginal academic term to a dominant political slogan, one that was used to serve Cold War strategy, Zionist interests, and global multiculturalism. This has paved the way for increased secularization in the West, as Christian values are gradually stripped of their theological roots and turned into vague ethical guidelines of the just be vaguely nice to one another variety. By merging Christianity with Judaism, it became easier to justify open-ended interfaith cooperation and policies that further weaken Christian influence and Western heritage through multiculturalist relativism, which is really just a fancy term for the denial of European heritage and history. The Judeo-Christian label is a modern fabrication, born not out of history, but out of political necessity. It did not exist in medieval Christendom. It was not a concept used by the Church Fathers, and it only became popular as a Cold War propaganda tool to unify liberal leaders against threats to their established order. Today, it serves an equally strategic function, secularizing Christianity, promoting interfaith dilution, and securing unquestioned support for Israel. The term is more than just an inaccurate historical label. It is a weaponized political construct that has been used to secularize Christianity, promote radical multiculturalism, justify costly foreign interventions, silence critics, and ultimately transform the West into a post-Christian civilization for nearly a century. To reclaim the true heritage of the West, not just Christians, but all Western men, must reject this fabrication and restore Christianity, and Christianity alone, to its rightful place as the sole moral and spiritual foundation of our society. If you found value in this discussion, then please consider subscribing, sharing the video, and leaving your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, God, family, duty.